Hi, I'm Dr. J. Varma, and welcome to Thermometer. On this channel, I track the status of infectious diseases and public health around the world and give you expert insights. This is our weekly episode of Inside Outbreaks. And on these episodes, I review the latest outbreaks of infectious diseases, the outbreaks that you need to know about. I do this with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jon Epstein, a veterinarian, virologist, and disease ecologist who, like me, has spent his career tracking infectious diseases across all corners of the earth. Thanks, Jon, for joining me today.
Thanks, Jay. Is it strange to say I'm actually really excited for today? I don't know why. I have a lot of interest in what we're talking about today. I just feel like I have a lot of enthusiasm and energy for this. I don't know if that's okay, given the topics we talk about, but at the same time, I think it's going to be a good one. So thanks for having me.
All right. So as all good scientists, I have two hypotheses. Okay. The first hypothesis is that we're geeks and we like there's a reason we spent our lives doing this, and we've made life challenging on our families by traveling a lot and doing all the things. So that's theory one. Theory two is it's such a beautiful spring right now in New York that, it's hard to not feel enthusiastic about everything right now.
That's true. If there's a remedy to seasonal affect disorder, it's springtime. And the weather's great. It's sunny out. I've been outside a lot, but it's a perfect segue into some of the things we're going to be talking about today. That springtime weather, when we start to see a lot of new wildlife being born and coming out. That's a teaser for our second topic today.
Exactly. All right. We're going to start off again. We don't always start off light and cheery, but we are starting off with something that is, I think, important to all of our viewers out there, especially if you have young children. And so that's about a rise in invasive strep infections. So when I say the word strep, I think most people naturally think of strep throat. It refers to the bacteria, which is group A, Streptococcus, and that normally causes a disease that many of us have gotten many times in our life, where you get an infection in your throat and you treat it with antibiotics. But there's also a phenomenon of invasive group A strep infections. So these are infections that aren't just in your throat, but they spread throughout your body. And the CDC reported a few weeks ago that group A strep infections have more than doubled from 2013 to 2022. And I want to be clear, these are the invasive kind of group A strep infections. So there's been a doubling over the past decade. And prior to that, rates of this type of invasive strep had been stable for 17 years. So 17 years of stability. And for the past 10 years, things have been doubling. And as I mentioned, group A strep is normally an infection where you get a bacterial infection in your throat, you get a fever, you get a headache, you get swollen lymph nodes. Unlike viruses, you don't get a stuffy nose, you don't get a runny nose, you don't tend to get a cough, and you can feel really lousy for several days. And the best way to treat it is with plain old regular penicillin or amoxicillin. And Jon, I know you have kids at home, and you've got a personal connection to strep and more dangerous versions of strep, I think, right?
Yeah, it's so interesting. When you're a veterinarian, some of the best ways to learn about animal health is have pets at home and pay attention to them. I'd say the same thing about infectious disease in kids. You want to learn about infectious disease, have kids, because they are like a magnet for them. So recently, my younger daughter did have a bout of strep, and it wasn't the invasive, super severe kind you were referring to, but it was pretty strong, and it was full-blown what we call scarlet fever, which people may have heard of. It sounds medieval, but what it really means is strep infection with a full body rash. So she had that. And what's really interesting is I tend to associate strep infections with throat, but the way this manifested was stomach and abdominal pain. And so I think that's important to mention. And I had a really astute pediatrician who years ago talked about when he sees kids come in with stomach aches, strep is on his mind. And it's true. So in this case, that's what she presented with, was fever and abdominal pain. And we had her tested for a bunch of different things, including strep, and it came up positive. So that was the first sign. And it actually never really manifested as much of a sore throat, although there was some redness back there, but it was mainly that. And fortunately, treatment with amoxicillin was really effective, and it worked. And I learned that there's very little resistance to amoxicillin, which is also good news. So that still is an effective frontline treatment for strep.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a moment, but it's actually funny that you mentioned this abdominal pain symptom and the astute pediatrician. I have my youngest is a son who's away at college, and he was back here over the Christmas holidays. and he got sick, and he had a fever, he had a sore throat, and he had abdominal pain. So I was absolutely convinced he had influenza, because one of the hallmarks of influenza is that you can also get abdominal discomfort. My wife, who's a pediatrician, was like, you need to be tested for strep. And we had like this bet over what he had. And sure enough, I
Yeah.
was wrong and she was right. So it's interesting
Good
that
for
you
her.
mentioned that. I think, pediatricians learn, a lot of pediatrics is because it's harder to do lab tests on kids, and you learn a lot of really good instinct, probably more than some of us adult medicine doctors do.
Yeah, no, it's really good. So I guess, it's terrible to think that incidence is increasing of severe invasive strep, but for the moment, it's comforting to know that the medicines and treatments that we typically use are still effective. But we have to stay on guard for that, because the more these things spread around, they have opportunity to evolve and develop resistance. So we do have to pay attention to efficacy of drugs.
Yeah, yeah. And so, that's a really important issue. I mean, the challenge that we have with treatment, of course, is that, some people have a penicillin allergy, and resistance can emerge without us really understanding why. And the reason I want to mention that is because one of the things we don't really understand about this rise in invasive infections is whether or not it represents some evolution in the bacteria. So just to be clear, invasive group A strep infections occur when the bacteria spread to areas of the body that are normally germ-free, such as your lungs or your bloodstream. And this invasive strep can trigger some really dangerous diseases. People I've probably heard about at some point about a flesh-eating disease. Well, that's often invasive strep. It's what's called necrotizing fasciitis, which is basically an infection of the space between your regular skin and kind of your lower, deeper muscle layers. And that's called this flesh-eating bacteria, or necrotizing fasciitis. It can also lead to a condition called toxic shock syndrome, which is an immune reaction that is kind of mirrors having a blood infection of the bacteria, but it's really just a toxin that's coming out from the strep infection. And so this has been really concerning, because even though we have a bacterial strain that does get treated with regular old penicillin, we know that when bacteria evolve to, let's say, cause more invasive forms, it may also mean that they evolve to develop resistance to antibiotics.
Mhm. Yeah, and there's so many bacterial diseases that do develop resistance quickly, and this is a whole area of global health right now that is up there among the most urgent priorities, which is combating antimicrobial resistance. And so, we're fortunate in the case of penicillins being effective against strep, but there are many bacterial infections where we're seeing resistance, and we need to continue to invest in drug development so that we can, compete in that arms race with bacteria and still have effective remedies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this has been one of, as a physician, we've always felt very confident about group A strep. But again, as we start to see the evolution of these new strains, I think we need to be on guard, both for unusual presentations of these infections, and also the possibility of being judicious in our antibiotic use, and only using them. Like in the example of, I was describing with my son, the debate was really like, does he get treated with an antibiotic, an antibacterial agent like an amoxicillin, or do we hold off, because he was kind of even out of the window, I think, of getting treated for influenza. And again, that overuse of antibiotics can be a problem, but we also need to be on guard that we don't want to miss these infections, particularly when they're invasive, because they do respond extremely well to antibiotics.
That's right. And it isn't like there isn't a cost sometimes to giving antibiotics, particularly in children, because let's remember, sometimes particularly broad spectrum antibiotics can affect the gut flora, the good bacteria that live in our GI system, and that can cause some problems too. So you really do want to have good, a doctor who's using good judgment about when it's appropriate to use antibiotics and when it isn't.
Yeah, I know this is actually a topic. I used to do a lot of work on antimicrobial resistance, and had really wondered about whether or not there might be some value in actually public health campaigns about the hazards of antibiotics and the
Mm.
dangers of them. And this is a double-edged sword, right? You
Yeah,
want
yeah.
to
Be
people
careful
and
with
have them
that.
be confident in the way we diagnose and treat diseases. But at the same time, you also want to make them aware. I think a lot of people just naturally assume that, oh, it's an antibiotic, it's just going to kill the infection and everything else is fine. But we know that antibiotics can, as you mentioned, alter the gut flora, what you have, your microbiome. That number one, that selects for drug-resistant bacteria, and those drug-resistant bacteria are pretty promiscuous. They exchange elements, and so they can make one bacteria resistant that isn't another. There's a lot of thought that, urinary tract infections, particularly, which are particularly a problem in women, one of the reasons you're seeing drug resistance in them is because they're these exchangeable elements. So it alters your gut bacteria, so it increases your risk of getting drug-resistant infections of all types. It alters your gut bacteria and can actually probably lead to things like obesity. There's actually good data to show that when you alter that bacteria, it changes the way you absorb things. There's also the risks in other hazards, the rashes, certain antibiotics can lead to joint problems. So it's important for people to understand that we as doctors don't use antibiotics carefully because we want to withhold something from you, because we have something good and we don't want you to have too much of a good thing. It's because we want to be cautious of balancing benefits and harms.
That's right. And it's good. And also what's really changed in medicine, and you could speak to this, but it's also true in veterinary medicine, is with the internet, people are much more self-educated about disease and health. But sometimes people will come in wanting to do something. So they will ask their doctor or their veterinarian for antibiotics to treat a disease. But if it happens to be viral, or if it's not the appropriate antibiotic, that could do more harm than good. So that's another challenge, is that a lot of times people feel the need to do something. They want to come away with a medicine, but it might not be the right thing to do from a medical standpoint.
Yeah, I think so. The most important advice we can give to people out there, particularly parents, is that if your child has an illness that involves a sore throat and a fever, make sure they get tested for strep, and rely on that testing from your doctor about whether or not you need antibiotics or not. Because if your doctor tests you and you don't, and there's two different types of tests you can do. So they can do both a rapid test as well as a culture, which is a little bit more sensitive and may take a little more time. Get tested and hold off on getting treated if that test is negative. And keep in mind that this also raises the importance of, we need a vaccine for this disease. And there really hasn't been enough work on developing one, because if we have a vaccine, then people will be prevented from getting the severe disease, and we need to use fewer antibiotics.
Yep.
So now we've talked a little bit already, we hinted at the beginning of this, about springtime diseases. And, Jon, I live in the city. I don't have a lawn. You, however, live in the suburbs now, right? And
Right.
you probably have to mow your lawn a little bit more regularly now. But did you know that mowing your lawn might make you sick?
I did. It is also baby bunny season. And I just the other day saw one in my yard and was taking all kinds of pictures because they're irresistibly adorable. But this is interesting. What comes with the birth of a lot of new wildlife, particularly rabbits, is a disease called tularemia. And this is
Yeah.
a bacterial disease. Go ahead, tell us about it.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to introduce it, and Jon, tell us more about tularemia. But the reason we're talking about this is exactly what you just mentioned, which is that there is some news out about that in 2024, so last year, 5 people in Minnesota contracted this rare bacterial disease called tularemia. They were all in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. And of those 5 people who were diagnosed, 4 of them had the disease in their lungs, pneumonia, and that you get that pneumonia from inhaling this bacteria. Now, and it's a very severe disease. Some of them weren't even diagnosed until they had left the hospital and had been treated with a whole bunch of antibiotics, and then eventually the tests came back. But the reason that we're talking about this right now is one of the ways you can get infected is by coming into contact with animals. And one of the strange ways of doing it, and I learned this when I was in my training, is that we would call this the lawnmower's disease. So, Jon, tell us a little bit about, what is this bacteria? How does it make people sick? And what does it have to do with mowing your lawn?
It's an interesting contrast between medicine and veterinary medicine in our education. You learned it as lawnmower disease. I learned it as rabbit fever. And so what we learned and what we know is that rabbits are the main reservoir of this bacteria. They tend to carry it naturally. And the organism is called Francisella tularensis. It happens to be one of the most contagious or infectious bacterium out there, meaning that you only need a very low dose, just a few bacterial cells, to make you sick, and it causes very severe disease. And what it means is that people, rabbits carry it when people come into contact directly with wild rabbits. But more often, the reason it's called lawnmower disease is you might have a rabbit that's died in your lawn, and in the course of mowing the lawn, you run over it and just absolutely obliterate it. But in doing that, it aerosolizes tissue from the carcass, and there will probably be bacterial particles in there. If you inhale them, that's one way to get exposed. It's also transmitted by ticks. It's also an arthropod borne disease, but when they're human cases, and they are rare, it's often been from this inhalation. And I'm from Massachusetts originally, so I learned about this as, there was an outbreak on Martha's Vineyard, and I think why it's called lawnmower disease back in maybe 2001. There were some cases there of people mowing lawns that were exposed that way, that had run over some dead animals. So it's not common, but it's bad when it happens, and it's something we should be aware of.
Well, it's funny you mentioned 2001. That's when I started training at CDC, and that's when I first learned about it.
Yeah,
I mean, I learned about the bacteria in medical school, but knowing it as a lawnmower disease was exactly what you just said. This outbreak in Massachusetts associated with people mowing their lawns, and it isn't, of course, unfortunately or fortunately, it isn't just rabbits that can carry this infection. The data from Minnesota, when they looked back at 2024, in addition to these human cases that they found, they also, tested a bunch of animals as well too. And of the 27 animals that came back positive for tularemia, 78% of the infections were in cats, 19% were in dogs, and only one was actually in a wild animal. Now, of course, that's because these specimens come from veterinarians, right? So they're going to more likely test, cats and dogs that people have in their homes. But
also, Jay, think about it.
So have you seen in your career domestic pets getting infected?
Absolutely. Because if you think about it, the way that those dogs and cats probably got infected was hunting rabbits. They probably were outside, and cats certainly will go after rabbits and kill them. And that's how they could get exposed. And I would guess the same for dogs. So they have a hunting instinct. They see a wild bunny, they go after it. And in the process of, killing it, they're going to get exposed. So that to me is the connection there. It's not that dogs and cats inherently have it, but they probably were infected from going after wildlife.
Yeah, and it turns out that cases of this disease actually have been rising in the United States. They've climbed by more than 50% over the past 10 years. And this disease is still pretty rare. It only affects about 200 to 300 people each year in the United States. But one of the reasons that CDC is always historically been on the alert of this disease, and one of the only reasons I spent some time learning about it, was because it's also, just as you mentioned, because it is one of the most infectious bacteria known to humans, it's an agent of bioterrorism, right?
That's right.
It's something that the US and other governments have feared, that because you can spread it as an aerosol, you can spray it through the air, and because it requires a very low infectious dose, if you're a bad actor and you want to hurt, American troops serving in a place, you could basically spray this bacteria through the air and rapidly disable a whole bunch of troops, or use it on civilians.
Yeah. And it brings up a good point. The CDC very carefully tracks pathogens, both viral and bacterial, that have the potential to be used as weapons nefariously. And we worry a lot, and we hear about a lot in the news about bioengineering and people creating pathogens. The truth of the matter is, nature is the best bioengineer. And a lot of these things we worry about occur naturally in typically wildlife. And so when you think about what could be used for nefarious purposes, it isn't some mad scientist in his basement, cooking up some super virus, but often people are just aware of things that occur naturally that could be used for bad purposes that don't require much tinkering to make effective.
Yeah, and this is why we've talked a bunch over the past couple of weeks about how dangerous it is to disable a lot of CDC's staff, both in the epidemiology side and the laboratory side, that work on these rare diseases. Because one of the reasons we monitor them isn't just because we're geeky and we care about unusual things. It's because they have real public health implications. And for a disease like tularemia, sure, there's only a few hundred cases a year. So yeah, you may not worry about it because it's not, making people sick on a day-to-day basis. But it could be a sign that somebody is intentionally trying to make people sick. And so just like law enforcement cares about even a potential threat of terrorism, we on the health side working with law enforcement care about any potential threat of bioterrorism.
That's right. That's right. And we need to continue to have experts and facilities that are capable of allowing us to work with these pathogens safely, and continue to develop therapeutics and countermeasures so we can protect not only civilians in the United States, but also our troops that are overseas, sometimes working in areas where these pathogens occur naturally and are fairly common.
So, this brings us actually to our final topic for today, which is we in the public health world need to constantly be practicing and exercising preparedness for rare and unusual diseases that might emerge. And so, Jon, we've been talking a little bit about off camera about work you've done in the past and what WHO has been doing. Tell us a little bit about this fictional disease called Mammothpox. And what recently happened at the global level to increase all of our safety and preparedness against new diseases.
Yeah, this is a cool story, and I just think there's lots of reasons why it is. Number one, we're aware that with climate change and warming, the sea ice is decreasing in the Arctic, and so a lot of new areas are opening up, and there are countries scrambling to establish territory and merchant channels through these new passageways. We're going to be spending more time in Arctic, northern and southern latitudes that probably were just inhospitable before. But what that also can mean is as permafrost starts to thaw, and we see that in summer months, it is possible that it could unearth microbes that have been frozen for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. And there's a lot of thinking that some of these might be things we haven't seen before. And what happens hypothetically if an animal carcass that had been frozen in the permafrost, since the ice age suddenly thaws out? Could that release or expose us to new pathogens, bacteria or viruses that could cause an epidemic? And so it's very common in public health to go through tabletop exercises, real drills where they engage ministries of health in different countries. This was a WHO level exercise. It was international, doing a what if scenario. What if, in this case, a mammoth carcass thawed out and released a viral agent, a pox virus, similar to Mpox or smallpox, that was infectious, that caused severe disease, and could be transmitted person to person. So we have a lot of now increasing human occupancy in Arctic regions, and this was the exercise. And I just thought it was so interesting because it isn't that far-fetched. It sounds like science fiction, but one of the ways we work in laboratories with microbes is we put them into a deep freeze. That allows us to store them, and then they can still be viable for when we need to work with them later on in the laboratory. So if you imagine, these microbes might be perfectly preserved in an animal host that died and then was instantly frozen in permafrost. And why I thought this particular story was interesting is that about 10 years ago, I was a scientific consultant on a TV show, a science fiction TV show called Fortitude. Stanley Tucci was the star of that, but it was about this kind of scenario where there were researchers, I think in Greenland, that unearthed a mammoth doing research, and in doing so, it thawed and released a plague. And so the whole story was about this mystery illness that was infecting people at this remote research station, and it was altering their behavior and causing, the kind of zombie-like behavior. But it was all about this kind of story. So, again, sometimes life is stranger than fiction, or life imitates art. But, this is something people have been thinking about for a long time, and the WHO is planning for this very scenario.
Yeah, and I think there's some reasons also why they chose Mammothpox. So I think what they're getting at here is, there's a group of viruses called orthopox viruses. The most famous and well-known orthopox virus is smallpox, which was eradicated from the earth through an aggressive and important global vaccination campaign that ran up until 1980. And then the most recent orthopox virus that people have been concerned about, of course, is monkeypox or Mpox, which has been causing endemic disease in Africa for many years, but basically evolved into both because of the virus as well as epidemiology into a disease that is primarily or transmitted actually through sexual exposure and through sexual networks that eventually spread from Nigeria to Europe to the United States and has become a global epidemic. And then the last thing I'll point out about orthopox viruses leading to mammothpox is something known as Alaska pox, or what was renamed as borealopox. And this relates to this question about climate change. So, in 2015, a new orthopox virus was essentially discovered in Alaska and given the name Alaska pox. And there's some question about whether or not this represents the evolution of or the emergence of a virus that previously may not have caused illness in humans until climate change somehow changed the ecology. Jon, what are your thoughts about Alaska pox and how that relates to the possibility of a mammothpox type outbreak in the future?
Yeah, well, look, there are, like most viral groups, we probably only are aware of a fraction of the viruses that exist within that group, and we're discovering more all the time. So the idea that there might be wild animals carrying a virus that could potentially be transmissible to people, but historically we haven't seen that emerge in people because there hasn't been much contact with a changing environment and a changing ecology in so many different regions of the world. The game is changing. There's different ways we're coming into contact with wildlife and creating new opportunities for pathogens like the boreal pox to emerge. And suddenly we're aware of it. So this idea just really isn't far-fetched. And I think that the more things change environmentally and the more our relationship with nature is altered, we're going to see more and more of these types of outbreaks of viruses and bacteria we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and that's a good place for us to close today. Just a reminder that as the weather gets nicer, for those of you who are, in northern hemisphere, temperate climates like us, enjoy your time in nature and do what you can to preserve it, because we know that nature is actually preserving nature is actually a great way to actually keep ourselves healthy. In addition to spending time in nature and breathing fresh air to be healthy, it's also a way of keeping ourselves healthy.
Yep. Enjoy the weather, and we'll see you next time.
Great. Thank you all. And if you enjoyed watching this episode of Thermometer, you enjoy learning about public health and infectious disease and emerging issues, please hit the like button. Please subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.